All right, let's get started here. I'll be moving through this pretty quickly because unlike when we're in class, you have the opportunity here to pause and absorb as we work through this. All right, so we got axial musculature here. This is where APR is really going to shine because we can remove different layers. So with the musculature here, we have some muscles that are very superficial right under the skin, while others are very deep and right next to bone. So we got to be careful here when looking at different layers, making sure we remove superficial to look at deep. All right. Let's see, for this information here, you're going to need to know, I'll go over this today in lab when you have me for the appendicular, but we'll need to know the origin and the insertion for each muscle, and then you'll need to know the movement. But if you know the origin insertion, you can pretty much guess the movement because you're just looking at what happens to when that muscle contracts there, and you can guess what's going to happen with that part of the body then pretty accurately. So origin insertion, if you don't know, origin is the part that typically stays stationary during a movement, and it tends to be more proximal on the body, and then the insertion tends to be more distal. So if you think about, I don't know, your shoulder here, you got the insertion or origin of your bicep up there in the shoulder, and then the more distal part that contracts moves to the origin, and that's the insertion. Okay, so you have a nice handy spreadsheet that you can get off of Canvas where we give you the simplified origin insertion for each muscle as well as the action. So your book has some, but they tend to be needlessly complicated, so we've taken those and simplified them for you. So print that off, and you can even move through that as you go through this PowerPoint here. So print off that spreadsheet. It's less detailed information there, so it's easier for you to memorize that info than it would be if you look at your book, which has some more detailed anatomy type stuff for your origin insertion and more complicated actions. So we've kind of simplified that for you. So today we'll go over not everything, but just strategies for how to study for this material. So axial musculature here it's not going to be too bad because we already know the axial skeleton that this musculature lies upon. So it's not going to be too bad. We got a nice base to start from. So the first thing we're going to do, actually, let's just flip to the very last slide here of this PowerPoint, because this will give us some tricks here and help with naming. Okay, so these muscles are categorized based on some different things, such as their action or the region that they're found upon, or maybe they're named after the origin and insertion. So for example here, I'll change this to a little laser pointer. Okay, so we got specific body regions here. So these are named for where they're found. For example, we have the oris orbicularis, which goes around the mouth. So oris meaning mouth. We'll get into this during the appendicular. Brachial, it's named for the upper arm, which is called the brachius. Some are named for their muscle attachments. So for example, we'll go over this one here, the sternocleidomastoid. So that's the sternum is the origin, and then also it goes to the clavicle, cleido, and then the insertion is the mastoid process. So that's how they are named and organized. And then some, we'll go over these as well, the orientation of the muscle fibers. So rectus means straight. Some muscles, those fibers are, straight up and down. Others are oblique or angled. So we'll talk about your external obliques, for example. Some are named for their size. Remember, major is large, minor is small. And then with appendicular, we'll get into the number of heads, biceps versus triceps. Okay. All right, so I feel like I skipped something here. All right, so with the muscles in the neck, we have those that produce our facial expressions. We have those that help move our eyeball, the extraocular muscles. There's muscles for mastication or chewing, we have muscles that allow for chewing and speech, the muscles of the tongue, and then we'll go over the anterior muscles of the neck, so those forward muscles, okay? And those involve things like neck flexion, for example. So as I mentioned, we have many different layers here for the axial musculature. So for example, if we look at the right side of this figure, that person's anatomical left, but our right, we can see those muscles that are deep, and these tend to lay right upon the bones. These tend to be more involved, at least obviously within the face, for chewing or talking, for example. Now the more superficial, when we look at the left side of this figure here, those tend to be more for our facial expressions. Okay, so let's just review some of these here. So right here we have the orbicularis oculi. Okay, so orbicularis simply means circling and opening. So that's that orbicularis. We have a couple. Here's one down with the mouth. And then oculi, remember this is one that was named after its region, means eye. So the orbicularis oculi. And then we have the orbicularis oris, because again, this is surrounding and opening, and oris, oral, think mouth. Now to picture what this muscle does, imagining this muscle contracting. So it surrounds the eye. When this contracts, it's going to squeeze that eye shut. So this is how we close our eye when blinking. How do we open our eye? Well, we can go right over here to this muscle. We have the levator palpebrae superioris. And we can just break this down, right? It's just Latin. So levator means to lift. Palpebrae, that's what we call our eyelids. So wherever you see palpebrae, we're talking about eyelids. And then superioris, above. So lift eyelid above. This is how we open our upper eyelid to open our eyes. Let's see here, other facial expressions we can make. We have the risorius here. So imagine contracting this muscle, right? It's found on the edges of our mouth here. So if we contract that, you can picture it just pulling the sides of our mouth here. And that's that little hallway smile we give each other. It looks kind of like a smug half smile when we walk by. That is due to the risorius muscle here. There's some more Latin. Depressor labii inferioris. Depressor means to depress or lower. Labii means lip. Inferioris, below. So you can imagine if this contracts here, it depresses our lower lip. Okay. We already went over orbicularis oris here. Oris meaning mouth. Some of these deeper ones then that are associated with chewing. We have the masseter. Masseter sounds like masticate, right? So this is one of our huge chewing muscles here that contracts, helps close the mouth. Okay. Nasalis. So this is how we flare our nares, or nostrils here. Imagine this muscle contracting, it pulls these nares out. That's how we flare our nostrils. And then deep to the masseter even, we have the buccinator muscle. So that's found right here. Buccinator, I like that thing, sounds like kind of like a bugle. And that's if you were to blow on a horn there. This is what stops our cheeks from just completely blowing out, helps contain there that muscle. So some bugle players get really strong buccinator muscles. Okay. So a lot of these you can see are just named for their origin, which tends to be some bone on the skull there. And then the insertion, at least in these superficial ones, is just someplace on the skin actually. So that's a little unique. Typically, our insertions aren't on the skin, but with our facial muscles they are, because it helps give our facial expressions. It pulls directly on that skin there. This is a great image of the origin and insertions, and in fact, if you go to APR, you can kind of isolate these individual ones here, so it's a little more clear even. All right, so here we have those external eye muscles here, and they're named, these are some of those that are named from the orientation of these muscles. So we have rectus and obliques. So rectus, remember we said, means straight, and oblique means angled or crossing over. So there are 6 of these muscles here. There's actually a nice little model of these that you can look at in the lab that is very helpful. But you can imagine what happens with eye movements with each contraction of these. So let's look at the lateral rectus here. So this is going to be on the lateral part of the body, not the medial, so more toward the outside. Imagine contracting this. What's it going to do to the eye? Well, it's going to pull that eye laterally. So that's how we look out to the edges. Now, on the other side then, we have the medial rectus. So that's going to help converge our eyes when that's contracted. It's going to kind of point both your eyes toward your nose, right, more medially. And then you can see we do have some oblique muscles associated with the eye. So here we have this superior oblique. Now it's oblique because look, it looks like it's going back here, but then there's a little tendon holding it in place. And then it actually attaches on the opposite side of the eye. Okay? So take a look at your little Excel sheet that we put together for you where you can look at the different movements when each of these contracts. You just got to look at the insertion point of each of these muscles and see how it would pull the eye if it were to contract. Okay? So again, superior rectus, it's going to pull that eye, and you're going to look upward. So they're pretty straightforward. All right, this is just another look here from the side. You can see that buccinator muscle here better underneath that masseter. So buccinator, bugle. All right, so the muscles of the neck here that would help us move our head for one, and then also involved in chewing. Most of these are named for the origin and insertion. So we'll have that origin being the first part of that name, and the second part of that name. So let's just start with one of these where that happens to be the case, named after origin insertion. Here's that sternocleidomastoid that I mentioned. So you can see here we have two different origins here. You have the sternum, that's the sternal part, the clado, that's on the clavicle here, and they both go up to that mastoid process, which inserts kind of behind the ear there. So you can imagine if we're contracting the sternocleidomastoid on both sides, that's going to give us flexion of the neck. That's going to pull this guy's chin downward to his sternum, all right? And then extension the opposite way. And if you were just contract one side of this, so a unilateral contraction here, the sternocleidomastoid, that's going to tilt your head one way or another, right? Okay, let's look at another one named for origin insertion, the sternohyoid here. So origin, the sternum, and then the insertion upon the hyoid bone, okay? And then another goofy one I'll point out here that's on your list, I think on your structures list, is just called the digastric. So di meaning two, gastric meaning stomachs. And that's because whoever did this initial dissection thought that these muscles look like bellies or stomachs. So we have the anterior belly here and the posterior belly. So those are the digastric muscles. All right. So there's two major divisions here along the vertebral column. There's the extrinsic back muscles, but these are involved more in positioning the girdles and upper limbs, so therefore they're part of appendicular here. But today we're going to focus on these intrinsic back muscles. See, these are the deepest of the back muscles, and they have three different layers here and are involved with either interconnecting vertebrae or stabilizing the vertebrae, part of the axial skeleton here. So superficial, intermediate, and deep. So let's take a look at those here. So this is the intrinsic again. The superficial here is made up of the splenius. These move up or down the vertebral column. And then the intermediate later is these erector spinae. So let's just take a look at these here. It's a little clearer when we have something to look at. All right. So let's start here with this splenius muscle. So remember the splenius here. These are the most superficial and are involved with lateral or flexion of the neck here. So you can see the splenius right up here, superficial. So next, if we move a little deeper, so less superficial, we'll move to these erector spinae. Remember, these are some of these intermediate layers here. Now, there are three of these you need to know. There's the spinalis, which is helpful because it's right next to the spine. Then there's the longissimus, runs vertically long up and down next to it. And then most lateral here, we have what we call the iliocostalis group. Okay, so you can imagine here if we have ilio, what's its origin? Well, it's on the iliac, so down in the pelvis. And then costalis, remember the costa are your vertebrae. And you can see they go to individual vertebrae here. So those are your iliocostalis group of the erector spinae. So you need to know the three different as we move from medial to lateral. I encourage you to look at the models that are up in the lab. Specifically, when looking at these, they do a good job. All right. Take a look at these oblique and rectus groups here. All right, actually, let me switch to a pen here, if I can. I'll go to, yeah, that's fine. Okay. So you're familiar, probably, you've heard of some of these, like your obliques and your abdominis rectus muscles here. So this shouldn't be too bad. So first we'll start with the intercostal muscles. So between all of your costa, or your ribs, you have muscles. There are external intercostals and there are internal intercostals that connect the superior to the inferior rib here. So if we start with the external or most superficial, these you can kind of see the orientation of the fibers, but these are oblique fibers. So they make this V shape. Okay? So we can see that. You can imagine your external here. They're just making V's this way. Okay? And then we have the internal intercostals that you can see the orientation of those oblique fibers running the other way. So these make an upside down V. So these are your external, and then these are your internal intercostals that are deeper to the external, obviously. So these external intercostals here, imagine if you're contracting these fibers, they are going to lift that rib cage up and out. And that is how we inhale. Okay. Now if we look at our internal intercostals here, they make that upside down V. Imagine contracting these. So when they contract, that is how we exhale, the internal intercostals. Okay. So let's move in and look at the oblique and rectus muscles now. So let's start with the obliques first. Remember that just is referring to the orientation of those fibers. So these are named for that fiber orientation, oblique. So we have external obliques and internal obliques. Okay. So first, our external obliques. This is nice because they make the exact same pattern as our external intercostals. So they give us this deep V here. Okay. And then deep to those, we have our internal obliques, and they orient in the other direction. Okay, so it's the same as our external and internal intercostals there. And then most superficial here, we have these rectus abdominis, and this is what we typically call the six-pack, right? So it's rectus because you can see they're not oblique anymore, they're straight up and down. So rectus abdominis. Okay, rectus abdominis. And then deep to the most deep, I guess we should go over order here. So it goes rectus abdominis is most superficial. Then we go to the external obliques here. Then we go to the internal obliques that are deeper. And then the deepest of these muscles is the transverse abdominis. Okay, transversus abdominis. And those are running, as you can imagine, in the transverse direction. So when they contract, they kind of tighten everything up there. Okay. Again, look at the models here. They're very helpful. Actually, you might have heard something if you've heard of diastasis with pregnant women. So that's where you get separation here of these rectus abdominis due to all the stretching that occurs during delivery and pregnancy. Diastasis, where those rectus abdominis muscles separate. All right, so muscles of the pelvic floor. So remember, there's muscles associated with the pelvic floor. Some people kind of forget about these, but you got to think there's muscles there to kind of hold all of your organs. It's like the bottom of the grocery bag, Manny likes to say. So in addition to support for these organs here, it also controls the movements of materials through the urethra and the anus. Excuse me. So this was going to be, well, urine and feces, basically, to get rid of these. And they also play this role in erection, and that's in both male and female here. So we'll talk about that here in a second. What's nice about these is that we share a lot of the same anatomy between male and female, so you don't need to know too much of the differences between them here. Let's go to a couple you need to know right off the bat. There's some you're familiar with, right? Like the anus, which involves these anal sphincters, obviously found on both men and female. Another one here is the bulbospongiosis. Okay, so that's involved with the erection of the clitoris in the female, and then also erection of the penis within males here. Bulbospongiosis. So we share a lot of the same anatomy, and this is where those models really shine in the back. So please, again, take a look at those. Oh, there's one more I should point out here. Pubococcygeus here. So this is one of those that is named for origin and insertion. So you can pubic bone, coccygeus, the coccyx, right, your tailbone. Okay. So ran through that here in 20 minutes, and it's perfect because I get to go off to lecture now. So I'll post this for you, and hopefully this helps.